Okay, somebody got the record button. Jolly good. um, so when we're holding ourselves accountable, we need to have really reliable and representative data, because we need to be sure of the data, before we start calls to action and so on. So that means a fairly rigorous data collection exercise. If it's a household survey, to make sure it's representative, that there's that level of professionalism. If it's administrative data systems, to make sure they're complete and so on. So the kinds of things that the rules of official statistics cover. But we can also use data for insights. So we can use data to say, let's say malnutrition is much worse in this region of the country than that region. And these data may not be the most reliable or the most representative, but are they enough to be able to say there's more of a problem here than there? And so we need to use data. And for example, if we start using big data, if we start looking at social media streams or something like that, they're not going to be representative. They're going to be biased in different ways, but they can still tell us, oh, something is bigger as a problem here than there. So I think there's a graded way of using data. You can even use data that are not top quality, as long as you can say, as long as you know which ways they might be wrong and whether that would upset the message you're trying to make. So that's what we've been working towards, and COVID, of course, made us had to focused our minds on this issue, because the COVID pandemic interrupted face-to-face household surveys and interrupted a lot of administrative data systems. So we had to say, well, what can we know, even if it's not to the same level of rigor as from a household survey, what can we know that will at least inform the response to COVID or inform the continued work that we need to do for development despite COVID. So it's it is a challenge, and it's a challenge because there's no right or wrong. It's knowing the data well enough to know what you can say safely from it. Don't know if that makes sense. Abdul Razak.
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to comment on the comparison between the statistics produced by the government and the other agencies. So I think first, what we need is, like, sometimes we have to check the time that we conducted the government conducted the survey and the time the other institution conducted the survey. So the time has an impact on the indicators. And the second, we need, for example, despite we have to, it's better to take the right number, but sometimes we have to also take the number produced by the government, because they are the custodian agency for the country. So that are the two comments that I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it is also, yeah, there are official statistics and we do have to use them, but we have to use them knowledgeably. I think it's almost going back to the same comment I was making earlier. The official statistics, because they're so rigorous, because they've been through so much quality control, maybe 2 or 3 years, out of date, or in retrospect. So when we're using those statistics, we need to be really clear about what they are telling us and what they're not. The example that I use is under 5 mortality. In many countries, we collect under 5 mortality data from household surveys, which may be done every 3, 4, or 5 years, and which are retrospective. So if you're wanting to look at change in under 5 mortality in the last 5 years, you won't get that from a household survey. And so you need to know that yes, this is the best estimate and this is the best official estimate that we have, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it interprets the current situation in the best way. And so we have to balance sometimes. You would say, well, yes, this is the official statistic. It may well be better now because such and such has happened, or it may be worse because such and such has happened. We need to be able to move forward from the official statistics to the interpretation of them. I see 3 things in the chat. One, I think, is asking if there's simultaneous translation, and I'm afraid the answer is no, not in the breakout rooms. Secondly, how can national human rights institutions be capacitated to develop a framework for quality data collection? And is that something UNICEF can help with? So the how is, in some ways, straightforwardly, yes, we can, any of the UN agencies, in fact, can draw on the experience of many other countries and bring that experience. That is one of the joys of working in the UN, is we can bring the experience of other countries as to how what kind of framework they have for developing statistical capacity or data analytical capacity, and how they've gone about it. So for UNICEF, obviously, because of our mandate, we come at this from a child rights point of view, and there are quite a few countries in which we work with human rights institutions, with the Office of Ombudsman and so on, to develop that capacity. Because indeed, it is crucially important for human rights institutions to understand the data that are around and to be able to do their own analysis, so that they can have an independent view of what is happening to human rights in the country. Country using big data or alternative data to monitor SDG indicators. So yes and no of examples. So the use of big data, and particularly satellite imagery data, analyzed using machine learning and other forms of AI, is increasingly being used, particularly for some of the environmental indicators, which are can be quite well monitored from by remote sensing, by using satellite imagery in particular, and perhaps drone imagery. For child-related SDGs, and they're probably the only source of data to be able to monitor those. So there's much more use of big data in some of the SDG indicators than others. For the child-related SDGs, big data are not used in any of them at the moment for actual monitoring of the SDGs. So the official reporting on SDGs and the annual monitoring of the SDG progress is not using big data, because the big data are not precise enough. They haven't been debiased and so on to be able to make the kind of estimate that you want to make when you're holding government in particular, but all of us, accountable for progress on the SDGs. However, we do have examples of using, let's say, social media data. We last year, or the year before, gosh, yes, time is passing. After the COVID hit, there was a lot of anecdotal evidence of a lot of talk about increased violence in the home because of all the lockdowns and the poverty and everything that was happening. And there's no conventional form of data collection that we could use to be able to work out where this was a problem and even how much of a problem it was. And so we analyzed social media posts to see whether there was talk about violence in the home. And we cross-referenced those to previous household surveys, like the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, which asks about violent discipline of children. And we found that the households where there were increased talk on social media about violence were the households where violence was violent discipline was more commonly used. And so that helped us to say, okay, we need to be targeting those groups or those households and so on with support. And we knew which households to be offering more support to, because they'd been identified previously in a household survey to have certain characteristics. So then we knew what to do. So it's not really for the monitoring of the SDGs that we use big data at the moment, but it's for supplementary analysis to say what may be happening, where should we be working together to be able to support particular households or particular communities or particular parts of the country. So good stuff. I'm enjoying myself. I hope anybody else is. Are there other things which are on your mind? Something you've always wanted to ask a statistician and have never had the opportunity. But I will bring it back to children because that's my life.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good morning, sorry.
Your afternoon, I presume.
No, it's morning for me.
It's
Maybe
morning
I'm
for you too,
hungry.
okay.
Okay, I'm Hope Perkins and I'm from Jamaica.
Okay.
I am really interested in how the big data work. So we keep hearing this big data,
Mhm.
but I have it in my mind. I'm pondering
Yeah.
what are some indicators that the big data could be used with for the SDGs.
Yeah.
And I'm also wondering if there is a country that has used big data for the SDGs that could assist us in how to really use big data. Because you keep hearing using big data, but it would be nice to see some practical examples of how it is used and with which indicators we can use it for.
Yeah, good. No, absolutely. And big data is a big term. I actually tend to talk about frontier data, which has 4 categories, which sometimes helps focus the conversation a bit. So there's frontier data, which are the kind of data that we generate. So the social media, web searches, things like that. So that's us putting information into the big wide world. And then there is there's frontier data, which is generated as a byproduct of what we do. So our cell phone data, every time we use a cell phone or we check something on a cell phone, a message is sent to a cell phone tower and that is recorded. And so that allows you to look at population mobility, for example. But that's a byproduct. It's not something we deliberately do. It just happens because we're using things. And then the third is what they like to call remote sensing, which is images from satellites and drones, which with a lot of heavy computing power can then be transformed into data sets which can be used for geospatial analysis. And then the last one is electronic, digitized government data, administrative data sets that are digitized, which are also very big and need particular kind of care in dealing with them. So each of these forms of frontier data are used in different ways. So I was mentioning about the remote sensing, the imagery data is used for looking at, the percentage of the environmental indicators. Percentage, you can tell these aren't child indicators, so I don't know them so well. But like the percentage of forest cover, and it looks at the FAO are using them quite extensively to look at crops and crop production and linking that to levels of hunger, for example. And UN Habitat are using them to identify slum areas and particular issues around those. So those are remote sensing. The call data records, as an example from the phones, are being used quite extensively in two ways. One is to try and map migration patterns, which has various problems with it, but it's being used by IOM in particular to be looking at migration patterns. But also we used them a lot to see the effect of lockdown and how that decreased mobility. We use them quite a lot to look at potential routes of disease transmission. So if people all go to a market on a Saturday, for example, and there's Ebola or one of the fairly infectious diseases around, then that's a possible route of transmission that then might go out. And the social media data, as I was saying, we can use to find changes in people's attitudes or behaviors. A lot of this cannot be used directly for SDG monitoring because they're still fairly approximate in various ways, but they're very useful for interpreting the data that you have, or for bringing them more up to date. What they like to call nowcasting, which is taking the last data point you have, seeing what elements of big data are correlated with that, and then if those elements from big data change in one direction or another, then there's a probable change in the underlying thing you're measuring. I'm sorry, those are all kind of big picture, but those are ways in which big data are being used to either to form official statistics or to interpret further from what we have from official statistics. And some of them are child related and some of them aren't. And I'd be happy to talk more at length, but just to give you some idea anyway.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And of course, I'm dying for an invitation to come to Jamaica, so, just saying. How are we doing? We're going to be called back very soon, I think. So, Abdul Razak, you are poised and ready to give some feedback to the plenary when we get called.
Yes. Thank you.
Excellent. Can we use remote sensing to measure poverty? I see you put in the chat as well. I see you were talking to me while I was talking to you. Yes and no. So yes, we can use it to approximate poverty. So what's very useful with remote sensing is once you have a poverty survey, which is a household survey, which is in sample areas, you can look at correlations like, roof type or amount of electricity, lights being used at night or things like that you can get from satellite areas. And you can estimate the level of poverty from there. It's not very good at estimating poverty on its own. Big data is much more powerful when it's used in triangulation with a household survey or with an admin data set or something where the level of coverage. Because the trouble with big data is you're inferring things. Firstly, you're inferring things that may not have a direct correlation. And the second is that remote sensing aside, but the social media data sets and the call data records are biased. So the poorest people don't use their phones very much and don't use social media very much, for example. So they won't feature as strongly in those kinds of big data sets. So you have to be able to adjust for that or account for that before you can use them. And the best way to do that is to ground truth what you have or triangulate what you have with a household survey. And then you can say, if I estimated poverty using this method, I would get to this level, but I know that this poorest group is underrepresentative, so I have to increase the estimated poverty rate. So they're really useful, but they're not so useful on their own. Much better when triangulated and ground truthed, as they tell me. So I think that I saw a message that we were being called back, but I didn't have time to read the message. Any last words from anybody?
Hello.
Hello?
Yes, my name is Sovereign Poyo. I'm a journalist. I'm in Ghana.
All right.
But usually, I'm going to ask this question because of what we've learned in the past, especially dealing with the government. If you are looking for data on how the government activities towards the SDGs are working in the area of or for the children, you get to see that the data is only from the state. And so the state can report to the international agencies on how they are working towards the children. But oftentimes you go to the ground and you get to see that the information there may not necessarily reflect what the state is reporting. And this happened in the, I remember Vision 2020, there were some of the activities that they said they would be able to do and all that. You go to the grounds and the grounds are reporting different information to you. In this case, we have from now up until 20, I think our time is almost up. In this case that we have from now up until 2030, how do we, especially as journalists and as CSOs, be able to prove to the states or authenticate the information that the state is putting out there on the work that they are doing in the area of children? How do we do that? Is there any lessons from any other part of the world where we can also learn lessons from, such that in our work to ensure that the state, what the state report is what is actually happening on the ground, we can take lessons from? Any information on that?
Yeah, thank you. One of the ways, I mean, the way of doing that is to have as much community involvement as you can. The general principle is that if data are collected from or collected about a community, then the data should be fed back to that community. And that is a way of validating the data in many ways.
Yeah.
And
I think to have my good friend, the CSOs, we have the space to come up with parallel reports. Some people will call it alternative report. Some people or others will also call it shadow report, whereby you use the data that might be available to you at the community or of your findings, so that when the government comes out with their information, you compare as to where they meet. And if there are some gaps, then you try to find out why the gaps, and then the solutions will come from discussions.